The singing was not something Sera chose to do. It was the cold, she decided later, the way it pressed through the stone walls of the lower corridor and settled into her chest like something borrowed, something she had been carrying for someone else and had simply forgotten to set down. She was alone. She was certain of that. The upper halls had emptied after the evening meal, and the guards who usually stood at the far arch had been called to the east wing, where Lord Castellan-Drave was managing some minor crisis involving the storage rations. Sera knew this because she was the one who had noted the inventory discrepancy 4 days prior and flagged it through the proper channel, which was to say, she had written it on a slip of paper and left it in the wooden tray on the steward's table, where it was found this morning and attributed to no one in particular. She did not mind that. She had stopped minding most things years ago, or had come close enough to stopping that the difference was not worth naming. So she was alone in the corridor, on her knees on the cold stone flags, her scrub brush moving in steady arcs across a stain that had been there since the last festival and had been worked around rather than addressed, by everyone except Sera. Her hands were reddened by the cold water. Her boots had a split along the left inner seam, patched twice with waxed thread, beginning to give again at the heel. She wore a wool overskirt someone had left in the laundry room 3 years ago that was never claimed, and it was too large across the shoulders, in a way that had stopped bothering her. It was into this stillness that the singing came. Not from anywhere else. From her. Low and shapeless at first. Barely a sound. More like breath, given a small direction. She did not know the song precisely. It was the kind of thing that assembles itself from fragments, a line from something her mother had hummed, a phrase she had heard from the cook's daughter once during a late autumn harvest, a rhythm that had lived in her hands and her body longer than her memory could account for. She sang the way she scrubbed, steadily, without performance, because it helped the silence feel less like something pressing down on her, and more like something that simply was. The torch at the far end of the corridor gave a single sideways lean, as though something had moved past it. Sera did not look up. The cold was playing with the draft, she thought. The east gate had been left unlatched twice this week, but the torch did not settle. It bent away from her, not toward her, which was not how drafts behaved. And then the sound came. It was not loud. That was the first thing. It was not the grinding of the old iron gate, or the echo of footsteps from 2 floors up. It was something below those things, underneath them, the way a stone's weight lives in its stillness, rather than in any noise it makes. A low resonance from the direction of the sealed wing, the place everyone on staff called the cold corridor, and no one cleaned and no one entered, not since before Sera had arrived at the fortress, not since before anyone currently employed here had arrived, if the older staff were to be believed. The door at the end of the east passage had been sealed in her predecessor's time, or her predecessor's predecessors. There was a lock on it that matched no key in the steward's box, and through it, or from somewhere behind it, came that sound. Sera sat back on her heels. Her brush rested on the stone. She listened, not with alarm exactly, but with the particular quality of attention she gave to things that did not yet make sense. The sound faded. The torch straightened. The cold in the corridor was only cold again. She went back to scrubbing, but she did not resume the song. She kept that detail to herself as well. Sera had been at Cairnvell for 7 years. She had arrived at 17, contracted through the placement house in the lower town, and she had been placed in the general domestic staff, which was the category that covered everything no one else claimed. She cleaned the corridors that the senior housekeeping staff assigned to other corridors did not clean. She maintained the supply records in the cold storeroom, a task that belonged to no one in particular, and so had fallen to her. She polished the iron fittings in the east wing, which were not visible during inspections, and therefore did not require polishing by any official measure, except that Sera polished them anyway, because the corrosion would compromise the wall brackets by spring if no one did, and she had simply noted that and acted on it, without expectation of acknowledgement. She did not have enemies at Cairnvell. She did not have, precisely, friends. She had colleagues who were not unkind, who passed her food at the staff table and said her name without hostility, and one or two who occasionally appeared in her doorway with a covered bowl of something warm on the nights when the schedule had kept her late in the cold rooms. Marin, the laundrywoman's oldest daughter, had done this most recently, setting a cup of spiced broth on Sera's small table without knocking or comment, in the way of someone who did not require thanks and did not expect it. Sera had drunk the broth slowly, standing, looking at the wall, and felt that something had been given to her that she had not asked for and could not quantify, which was not the same as not feeling it. Her designation was Omega. This was not remarkable at Cairnvell, where the domestic staff was composed largely of Omegas and Betas, the kind of labor arrangement that was simply the architecture of a great house, rather than an intention about anything. No one made particular use of the designation to be cruel. They simply did not think about it, which was its own kind of physics. Sera existed in the house the way that cold storeroom existed. Necessary when you needed what it held. Invisible in the interval between needs. She took her meals last. She submitted her inventory records weekly in the wooden tray where they were collected and occasionally credited to whoever pulled them from the tray. She slept in the small room off the east service corridor, the one with the window that did not fully close, and that she had packed with cloth in the autumn to stop the wind. She had been in that room for 7 years, and in 7 years she had made it neither comfortable nor uncomfortable. It simply was what it was. She had made peace with most things years ago, or something so close to peace that the distinction was not worth making. She did not think about the sound in the corridor again. She did not think about it the next night either, when she was covering the iron grates in the west passage. With the rust treatment she mixed herself, and the sound came again, longer this time, and lower, and with something almost structured in it, the way a sleeper sometimes makes sounds that are not words, but are reaching toward them. She stopped what she was doing. She looked toward the east passage. Nothing. She went back to the grates. But on the third night she was singing again. She had not chosen to. She was carrying a load of folded cloths back to the linen room from the upper storeroom, alone again, taking the shortcut through the lower hall that no one used because the footing was poor near the drainage channel. She was cold. The cloth draped over her arms was warm enough to make the contrast unpleasant, and she was singing beneath her breath, that same shapeless, accumulated thing, the line from her mother, and the phrase from the harvest, and the rhythm that came from somewhere in her body she had no name for. The sound from the east passage was immediate. It was not a reaction to be frightened by, Sera thought, standing very still in the dark corridor. It was the sound of something very large turning over in its sleep. She had grown up in the country. She knew what a sleeping animal sounded like when something in the air reached it. This was that sound, amplified, altered by stone and distance, but that sound. Her arms tightened on the linens. She breathed out slowly. She walked the rest of the way to the linen room, put the cloths away with precision, and spent the remainder of her walk back, cataloguing what she knew. There was something in the sealed wing. It responded to her voice. It was not waking, or not exactly waking. It was stirring, the way something does when warmth comes close to a cold place, and the cold place does not know what warmth is anymore, but remembers, somewhere below reason, that it once did. She did not report it. There was no tray for a report of that nature. She kept the knowledge in the way she kept most things, quietly, accurately, without drama. The fourth night she sang again, longer, and what came from the east wing in return was a sound that passed through the stone and through the floor and through the soles of her patched boots and entered her somewhere below the ribs, a resonance that was not pain and was not quite comfort, but lived in the narrow territory between them. She stood in the corridor for a long time after it faded, her hand pressed flat to the cold wall, feeling the last of the vibration leave the stone. She had not heard anything like it. She did not know what to do with that. She went to her room and packed the cloth more firmly into the gap in the window frame, and lay down on her narrow bed and looked at the dark ceiling for a while before she slept. She told no one. There was, as yet, nothing to tell. But something had heard her, and something in her had answered it, and that exchange lived in the air between the east wing's sealed door and the place where she stood every night, doing work that belonged to no one in particular, until it fell to her. The Castellan of Cairnvell was not in residence during those first weeks of deep winter. Sera knew this the way she knew everything about the fortress's logistics, from the supply records, from the adjusted meal counts, from the small economies that the steward applied whenever the upper household was reduced. Lord Drave had mentioned in passing, to no one in particular but in Sera's vicinity, that the king had gone to the northern border for the season's settlement, as he did each year at this time, and that Cairnvell was merely the king's northern holding, not his seat, and therefore had the relative quiet of a house in between purposes. Sera had never seen the king. She knew what was said about him, the way all the household staff knew it, in the layered and informal way that information travels through a great house. His name was Aldrich. He was old, though this was said with a different quality than the ordinary use of the word, the way it was said about the fortress walls, or the deep well, or other things that had been present through so many ordinary seasons that they had become difficult to imagine as not having always existed. He had reigned for a very long time, longer than memory served, by the accounting of anyone currently living in the household. The older staff said 3 centuries, and some years, which Sera thought was plausible only in the abstract, the way she thought about certain distances, true, but not something her body understood. He had a wolf. Every wolf-blooded alpha had a wolf. That was simply the nature of the designation, but the king's wolf was spoken about in a different register, with the quality of something set apart from normal usage, something touched by more than the ordinary. Old Fenwick, the archive keeper, who had been at Cairnvell for 50-some years, and who treated Sera with the particular collegiality of a person who had largely stopped distinguishing between ranks, had told her once, while she was organizing the lower shelves of the archive room, that the king's wolf had not been active in living memory. Not sleeping, Fenwick had said, with the precise care of a man who believed in the accuracy of words. Sleeping is ordinary. What it is something else. Gone under, sealed off. He had returned to his catalogue then, and Sera had returned to the shelves, and neither of them had addressed it further. She thought about this now, standing at the east passage arch on the 5th night, her scrub bucket set to one side, and her brush in her hand, listening to the resonance fade from the walls. 3 centuries, the sealed wing, a wolf gone under. She did not make a leap. That was not how Sera thought, but she stood with the pieces and let them lie adjacent to each other, which was as far as she was willing to go without more information. The king returned on a Tuesday, at dusk, with a party of 6 riders and no ceremony. Sera knew this, because she was in the courtyard stacking the exterior wood supply when the horses came through the gate, and she pressed herself against the stack and waited for them to pass, because that was the correct thing to do with horses and narrow spaces, and she had no particular feeling about it beyond the practical. The riders moved through. The last one was not a rider, but the man who had ridden at the center of the group, who had dismounted before the gate and walked the final approach on foot. He was not what Sera had formed from the household's descriptions, which had tended toward the superlative in a way that made her discount them. He was large, yes. He was the kind of large that occupied space rather than filled it, which was a meaningful difference. He stood in the courtyard, and the courtyard arranged itself around him as though that had always been the intention. His hair was dark. He wore a traveling coat in a color between charcoal and brown, no ornamentation. He was moving past her in the manner of someone who had walked into this courtyard a great many times and had no remaining need to look at it. Then he stopped. It was brief, and it did not look like anything, and she would not have named it if she had not been watching closely, which was her habit, and she was. His head turned a fraction toward the east wing. He stood very still for 2 or 3 seconds. Not the stillness of looking, but the stillness of someone who has heard something and is deciding what to do with it. His profile was angled slightly away from her, and she could not see his expression with any certainty. Then he continued walking. He did not look at the east wing again. He did not look at her at all, which was unremarkable, and she thought nothing of it. But that night, the sound from the sealed wing did not come, even when she sang, and she was not certain whether that absence meant something had quieted, or whether something had simply turned its attention elsewhere and was listening in a different way now. She kept the uncertainty in the same place she kept everything else. The first time the king came to the East Passage was not at night. It was early morning, the particular early that exists before most of the household has oriented itself, when the corridors still hold the cold of the previous dark, and the torches have not been fully refreshed. Sera was in the passage because she was always in the passage at this hour, working through the maintenance tasks that she had assigned herself, on no authority but her own assessment of what needed doing. She was repacking the drainage channel with the clay and fiber mixture she had asked for from the maintenance stores 3 times through the wooden tray and received once, and was stretching what remained. She became aware of him before she heard him, which she could not fully account for, and did not try to. The temperature in the passage did not change. There was no sound of footsteps she could isolate with certainty, but the space behind her had a quality it had not had before, a density, and she knew without looking that she was not alone. She did not startle. She continued packing the channel joint, pressing the mixture in with her thumb in steady increments. He said nothing for a long moment. Then, "What are you doing?" It was not aggressive. It was the voice of someone who asked questions when they wanted information, without decorative phrasing. "Sealing the drainage joint," Sera said. "The water, pooling from the east arch, freeze, will compromise the floor flag here by late winter if the joint is open." She did not look up yet. "I put in 3 requests for clay compound through the steward's tray. I received enough for this section." A pause. "I was not told the east arch had a drainage issue. It was in the reports." Another pause, longer. "What is your name?" "Sera." She looked up then, because not doing so for longer than this would have been its own kind of performance, a performance of indifference she was not willing to put on. He was standing 4 feet from her, more or less, wearing the same traveling coat from the night before, or one very similar to it. He was looking at the drainage channel, not at her. His jaw was set, and his eyes were the color of a sky that intends rain without committing to it. "You work in this passage, and others." He looked at her then, briefly, with the quality of attention she associated with people checking whether what they'd heard was accurate. Then he looked back at the wall. "Have you heard anything?" "From that direction." He did not indicate the sealed wing, but she knew what he meant. She considered him for a moment, the careful question, the way he was not quite asking what he was asking. "A sound through the stone," she said, low, irregular, "first 4 nights of this week." Something in his face did not change, and also, fractionally, did. "When?" "Evenings, when I was working late. You weren't alarmed. I was attentive." He looked at her again. This look was longer, and it had a quality she could not immediately classify, not scrutiny, not the kind she was accustomed to from people assessing whether she was doing her assigned work. Something else, something working at a problem it had not expected to have. "Don't go anywhere," he said, and walked toward the sealed wing. She sat back on her heels and watched him go. He stopped at the iron door, placed one hand flat against it, stood there for a long time. She went back to packing the drainage joint, because there was nothing else for her to do, and because the work still needed doing. But she was aware of him the entire time, in the same way she had become aware of the sound through the stone, not with alarm, but with the kind of attention that once given could not be easily reclaimed. When he turned and walked back past her, he said nothing further. He slowed almost imperceptibly as he passed, and she thought, she was not certain, that he turned his face very slightly, the way someone does when a scent catches them and they are trying to place it. Then he was gone. Sera looked at the drainage channel. She pressed the last of the compound into the joint. Fennec was not easy to find when he did not wish to be found, which was most of the time, but Sera had been using the archive room for quiet work for 3 years and knew his habits well enough to appear at the right hour, with a purpose that required a shelf near where he was sitting. She spent a few minutes organizing the lower records before she said, without looking at him, "How old are the accounts of the sealed wing?" Fennec made the sound he made when something had finally been asked that he had been waiting for someone to ask. It was a small sound, not quite a sigh, and not quite satisfaction. "Old," he said. "The first entry I have is 160 years back, but the event it describes is older, 3 centuries, give or take the decade." "What event?" He turned a page. The king's wolf went into what the account describes as a sorrow sleep, which is not a clinical term, as I've told anyone who has listened, but it is the term in the document, and I preserve the document, not improve upon it. He looked up. There was a mate. She died. The wolf refused to. Well, the wolf refused. Sera processed this, and the sealed wing. The wolf retreated into it, locked the door from the inside. By the time anyone could enter, what was in there was... He paused. The word in the account is echo. What remained was the echo of something that had been. Not gone, not present, an echo. She looked at the shelf. And the king. Fennec was quiet for a moment. He has managed without it for a very long time. Managed is the word I would use. Not flourished. No, not flourished. She was quiet. She pulled a record from the shelf and turned it in her hands without reading it. The account from 160 years back. What does it say? Fennec turned several pages. A servant, female, working in the East Passage. Noted hearing a sound from the sealed wing. He looked at her over the edge of the document. It says nothing came of it. What happened to the servant? The account does not say. That was the shape of things, Sera thought. Accounts that noted without concluding. Staff who heard something and were recorded as having heard it, and were then absent from further record. She set the document back on the shelf, with the care she gave to all documents. "Thank you, Fennec. I didn't tell you anything in particular," he said, already turning back to his work. "No," she agreed. "You didn't." The conversation with the king in the East Passage repeated 3 more times in the following 10 days, each one quieter and longer than the last, each one occurring in the early morning when the corridor was empty. He arrived without announcement. She was always there. He would stand at the sealed door for a time after they spoke, and she would continue her work, and the shape of this, the working, the standing, the space between, had a quality she did not name, but felt the contours of. On the 4th morning he did not go to the sealed door at all. He stood near her work and watched her, not in the way of someone supervising, but in the way of someone who had come to a specific location for a specific reason, and was no longer pretending the reason was the door. "You sing," he said. She looked up. "I do. In this corridor. At night." She considered denying it, briefly, in the way one considers a route before taking the better one. "Yes." It responds. "It has. Yes." He crouched then, which surprised her, not the crouching itself, but the evenness of it, the way he brought himself to her level without it being a gesture toward her so much as a decision about how to have a conversation. He looked at the drainage channel, the section she had finished, and the section remaining. "In 300 years, he said, and stopped. He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. I'm not doing anything deliberate, Sera said. I want to be accurate about that. I'm not attempting to. She paused, looking for the right word. I know, he said. That's what I can't explain. They sat for a moment in the cold air of the passage, the torchlight reaching them from opposite ends and meeting somewhere near the middle. Fenwick's records mention a servant, she said, 160 years ago, who heard the same sound. He was quiet, I know. What happened to her? He turned his head and looked at her, and the look had the quality of a door opening a measured degree, deliberate, controlled, revealing something without releasing it entirely. She was moved to a position in the southern house, for her own protection, from what the household would have done with the information, from what it would have made her. Sera thought about that, and the sound stopped. Yes, because she was moved. Yes. She turned back to the drainage channel. She pressed her thumb into a joint. She felt the familiar quality of a decision assembling itself in the space below conscious thought, the way her work decisions assembled, from evidence, from pattern, from the plain arithmetic of what was needed and what was available. I'm not going to be moved, she said. He did not respond immediately. I've noted that, he said, finally, and something in his voice had a quality that was not quite dry and not quite warm, but lived near both. She went on working. She went on working. He stayed until the corridor began to fill with the sounds of the waking house, and then he stood and left, and she tracked his departure in her peripheral vision with the same quality of attention she had begun to understand she could not take back, and was no longer certain she wished to. She had been at Cairn Vell 7 years. She had never been given a reason to remain other than the contract and the work, and the contract had been sufficient. She thought, packing her tools into their cloth roll, that this had shifted in some way she did not yet have the language for. The threat arrived on a Wednesday, which Sera found fitting in the way that unpleasant things often chose unremarkable containers. Castellan Drave was not a cruel man. She had worked under his stewardship for 7 years, and had not once been mistreated, not been addressed with contempt, not been given work that was punitive in intent. He was an administrator of genuine competence, and his interest in the household's smooth operation was real and organized and exhausting to observe closely. He also had, as Sera had noted with accuracy rather than charity, a finely developed sense of what was good for Lord Drave, and a facility for arranging the two interests, the household's and his own, so that they appeared to be the same interest, and he appeared not to be making a distinction. He called her to his office at the 2nd hour of the afternoon, which was the hour he used for minor administrative corrections, which told her something. "Sera," he said, without looking up from his table, "there has been a concern raised regarding the East Passage." She waited. Specifically, regarding staff entering the passage after hours, and the barded disturbances that have been reported by 2 of the senior guards. "I file maintenance reports," Sera said. "The drainage work is documented. The maintenance work is not the concern." He looked up then, and his face had the expression of a man performing an unpleasant but necessary administrative function with the care it required. "The concern is the irregularities in the sealed wing, the sounds, He set down his pen. "Sera, the sealed wing is a protected area. It is not a matter of maintenance jurisdiction." "I haven't entered it." "No," he paused, "but there is a matter of proximity, association. There are members of the senior staff who feel that an Omega servant, working unsupervised in that corridor, in the hours when the disturbances occur, is an irregularity that requires formal review." He let the phrase sit. Formal review was the mechanism. She understood it entirely, not a dismissal, but an inquiry, with the result of an inquiry already arranged before it began. She was going to be removed from the corridor. That was the architecture of it. Not because of cruelty, because she was a useful explanation for something that made the senior staff uncomfortable, and Drave needed to give them one. "I would like to submit documentation," she said. A slight pause. "Of course. The review will. I would like to submit it before the review opens, so that it forms part of the record, rather than a response to it." Drave looked at her for a moment, with the expression of a man recalibrating. "That is, yes, that is your right. Thank you," she said, and left. She went to Fenwick. She spent the remainder of the afternoon and the whole of the following morning in the archive room, and Fenwick was there the entire time, pulling documents from the cases she could not reach and setting them on the reading table without being asked, occasionally making a dry comment about the indexing system of a century prior, otherwise simply being present in the way of someone who had decided to be present without making an occasion of it. What emerged was a record, not a complete one. Nothing in a house of this age was complete, but enough. 4 instances across the history of Cairnvell of disturbances in the sealed wing corresponding to the presence of specific staff in the East Corridor. 3 of the 4 resulting in quiet relocation, notes in the accounts that used phrases like "restored to normal," "disturbance resolved," "no further irregularity." The 4th instance, the oldest, was different. The 4th was accompanied by an annotation in a different hand from the main record. The annotation read, "Sound consistent with the old accounts of a waking, dismissed following removal of proximity. Assessment, inconclusive." Inconclusive, Sera noted. Not resolved, not normal, inconclusive. She copied the relevant passages in her own hand, accurately, without interpolation or embellishment. She noted the dates, the staff designations, the pattern of correspondence. She wrote at the top of her document, "Historical record of sound events in the East Wing of Cairnvell, compiled from archive materials held in the main records room," and at the bottom she wrote her name. She submitted it to Drave's tray at the end of the 2nd day. She also, because she was Sera and because she had noted the relevant detail, left a copy on the archive shelf, where it now properly lived, cross-referenced to the original accounts. She did not go to the king. She was not certain whether this was restraint or pride, or something more plainly practical, which was that she had not been asked. She had not been asked, and then she was. The morning after she submitted the document to Drave's tray, she was in the East Passage before first light, and the king was already there. Not at the sealed door, at the place where she worked, standing at the edge of her lamp's reach, his arms loose at his sides. She set down her tools and looked at him. "Drave spoke to me last night," he said. "I imagine he did. He showed me your document." She waited. "Sera," he said her name with a precision that was different from how he had said it before, not placing her in the household, placing her in some other accounting, one she did not have the full shape of yet. "You built an argument from 160 years of archive records." "I organized existing information," she said. "The argument was already there." He looked at her steadily. The lamp gave the air between them a color that was between amber and gold, the way morning came through old glass. "The review has been set aside." She felt the small settling sensation of a thing resolved, like a joint packed correctly, like a window that finally shut. Not elation, resolution. "Thank you," she said. "No," he stopped her. "Not because Drave chose not to proceed, because I told him that the East Passage and its maintenance are under my direct authority, and that the staff currently assigned to it are not subject to review without my involvement." He paused. "Which is not a protection I offered to those who came before you." She absorbed this. "Why?" she said. He was quiet for a moment, in the way of someone choosing the accurate answer over the available one. "Because when I stood at that door 2 weeks ago and felt what I have not felt in 300 years, I had 2 responses." He turned his head, looking toward the door, and she saw what she could sometimes see in his profile when he was not composed entirely for the world. the great age of him, not as decrepitude, but as weight, the weight of someone who has been at the edge of something enormous for a very long time. One of those responses was that I did not want to know what it meant. And the other? The other was you. The air in the passage held that. Sera looked at the drainage channel, the section she had been working toward all week, the last joint of the east arch stretch. She looked at her tools laid out on the cloth. "I'm not a solution to something," she said. It was not a challenge. It was accuracy. "No," he said. "You're not." He turned back to her, and his eyes had the quality she had been coming to understand as his version of openness. Not warmth performed for the room, but warmth exerted quietly, in a very specific direction, toward her. "I'm not choosing you because the wolf responds. I would not do that to you. I am choosing you because in the 2 weeks since I returned, I have found no one in this household, and very few in my considerably long memory, who does what needs to be done without being asked, builds a legal argument from raw archive material at 24 hours' notice, and tells me plainly that she is not going to be moved." He paused. "Those are separate things from the wolf. They are mine. I am claiming them separately." She was quiet for a long time. "That's a considerable amount of words," she said. The corner of his mouth moved. It was not a smile, and it was not a smile. "I've been saving them," he said, "for 300 years. She looked at him. She looked at the sealed door at the end of the passage. She thought about the sound through the stone, the resonance that had entered her below the ribs and lived there ever since, not as pain and not as comfort, but as something that had been waiting to be one of those things, and did not yet know which. "I'd like time," she said. He nodded once. Not quickly. Deliberately. "Yes." "Not because I'm refusing," she said. "I know." He looked at her steadily. "I've waited 300 years, Sera. I know how to wait." She went back to the drainage joint. He left. Something in the east passage had changed, in the way that air changes after a storm has passed through, not empty, not disturbed, but settled into a new arrangement that felt, paradoxically, more like it had always been there. She spent the remaining winter at Cairn Vell in the way she had spent the previous 7 winters, working, keeping records, being present in the East Passage before the household woke. The difference was that she was no longer unnoticed. It was not announced. Nothing was announced. But the senior staff began, in the small instinctive shifts that Sera recognized as biology preceding thought, to arrange themselves differently. The head housekeeper, who had never once looked at Sera directly in 7 years, held a door. A guard, who had twice walked through Sera's floor washing without acknowledgement, stopped and waited. Small adjustments, none of them commented upon, each of them a sentence in a language her body understood before her mind had sorted out the grammar. Pack witness. She knew it for what it was, the room registering what had not yet been spoken. Marin, who noticed most things and asked about none of them, left 2 cups of spiced broth at Sera's door in the 3rd week of February. Sera drank both, slowly, standing at her small window where the cloth packing held firmly against the cold. She and the king continued to meet in the East Passage in the mornings. The conversations grew longer. He told her, in the economical way of someone not practiced in telling, about the mate who had died. Her name had been Cassia. She had died of a fever in the 2nd year of their bond, and the wolf had gone under in a grief so total that it had ceased, for all practical purposes, to exist. 300 years. He had managed the kingdom from the husk of what remained. Managed. She remembered Fennec's word. "You've been in pain," she said. On a morning in early March when the cold had begun to release its grip on the stones, and the drainage work was complete, and she was moving on to the iron brackets in the far arch. "I stopped registering it as pain some time ago," he said. "It became the ordinary state." She considered the bracket in her hands. She thought about the bondache she had read about, the thing that calcified when denied long enough until the character had mistaken it for their normal state. She thought about reunion feeling like a pain you forgot you were carrying, finally lifting. She did not say this. She turned the bracket over and examined the corrosion on the underside. "I know something about that," she said. He was quiet. "Not the same scale," she said. "I'm not claiming equivalent experience." "No," he said, "but the same category." She looked up. He was looking at her, with the expression she had come to know as his version of a complete sentence, the one that did not require any further words. Spring came. The sealed door, one morning in late April, stood open. Not all the way, a few inches. The darkness on the other side was not the darkness of a room, but the darkness of something immense, and from it came a warmth that had no right to exist in an east-facing stone corridor in the early morning. Sera stood in front of it for a long time, her lamp in her hand, listening. The sound came, not through stone this time, directly, into the air of the passage, into the space between them. It was not frightening. It was the sound of something enormous, and old, and suffering, recognizing, across 300 years of dark and silence, that it was no longer alone. Sera set down her lamp. She sang, low and shapeless and without performance, the line from her mother, and the phrase from the harvest, and the rhythm from somewhere in her body she had never been able to name. The wolf breathed. She came to him in early summer. Not dramatically. She did not do things dramatically, but in the East Passage on a Tuesday morning, her tools in their cloth roll, and her boots still patched with waxed thread. No reason to replace something that was still doing its job. He was at the sealed door, which was fully open now, and had been for weeks, the sealed wing no longer sealed but quietly, daily, becoming part of the house again. She came and stood beside him, close enough that their arms nearly touched, and looked into the wing's long corridor, where the morning light from an uncovered window fell in a clean, low line. "I've decided," she said. He turned to look at her. She met his eyes, unflinching, in the way that had always been her particular quality, and that she had never thought of as remarkable, because it was simply the way she looked at things. "Not because the wolf recognized me," she said. "I want to be clear about that." "I know," he said. "Not because of what it means for my position." "I know." She looked back into the corridor. The light lay across the stone floor and did not move, the way light does in early summer, as though it has finally found where it intends to stay. "Because I trust your accuracy," she said, "and you trust mine. And in my experience that is rarer than most things people call rare." He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. She nodded once. She bent down and picked up her tool roll. "I still have the far brackets to finish." "I know," he said, and she could hear in the plain word the same quality she had heard in everything he said to her in that corridor over the long winter. Not drama, not performance, but something settled, something decided, the sound of a door held open by someone who had been standing at it for a very long time and was not going to move. She went to work on the brackets. He remained at the door. The wolf, somewhere in the wing's quiet interior, made a sound that was not like any of the previous sounds, not a rumble through stone, not a cry through 3 centuries of grief, but something even and low and new, the sound of a thing that had been waiting to be ordinary and had, finally, become it. The mornings at Cairnvell did not change, except that they did, in the way that all permanent things change, not in their shape but in their weight, in what they held. Sera still arrived in the East Passage before the household fully woke. She still carried her tools in the cloth roll. The boots were resoled in the autumn, not because she felt any ceremony about it, but because the seam had finally given entirely, and there was no point in patching a thing that had reached its limit. She kept the cloth packing from the winter window on her work table, a small compressed square of wool and cotton, for no reason she would have been able to explain, except that she did not see a reason to discard it. He was usually there when she arrived, or came shortly after, with the quiet reliability of someone who had relearned how to move through a morning as something more than routine. The wolf moved through the open wing now, and sometimes came to the passage arch to lie in the early light, enormous and unhurried, its great head resting on its forepaws with the expression of an animal that has survived something enormous and chosen, on the other side of it, rest. They did not perform their belonging. There was no audience they required. What they had was the passage, and the work, and the plain, unhurried exchange of two people who had each spent a long time invisible in their own way, and had found in each other not an audience, but a witness. Sera pressed her thumb into the last joint of the new season's maintenance and felt it hold. It was not remarkable, it was simply the morning, and the morning was hers, and it was everything. Would you have stayed in that corridor, singing into the dark, not knowing what was listening? Let me know in the comments below.